All right, welcome everybody. This is Michael Forrester with Webage Solutions. I am a senior technical trainer and DevOps advocate for Webage Solutions. And today I'm going to talk about basically how to get started and continue a journey of mastery for AWS web services in particular. So the goal here is to talk about how certification, whether you are getting certified or not, how the certification path can assist in learning AWS and how you can leverage the certification resources, even if you're not necessarily going for certification, but how you can leverage those resources to gain mastery in AWS regarding your particular role. So before I move forward, because it's always useful to check, can everyone hear me okay? Because I'm getting feedback from Zoom that everything is working, but I would love to know for certain from a participant. So if you could type in the chat, that'd be awesome. Okay, excellent. And I see there were the statements about the link. I'll check on it after we're done to make sure it is shared properly, just in case there's some kind of error on my end. All right, so, but the answer to the question is yes, we will be sharing the presentation with all the panelists. All right, so let's dive into it. So the objective here is just to show some clear steps about how to get started and build continual mastery on AWS. To that end, we're going to talk about some prerequisites. We're going to have a conversation about step-by-step for certification prep as a means of acquiring expertise, not necessarily just certification. I can't emphasize that enough. You can follow these paths whether you want to schedule an exam or not, because you don't even see schedule an exam listed on here, but it is actually step 7 if you're so inclined, right, for certification. The third part is to talk about hands-on resources. Just because at Webage Solutions, we are one of 5 US Amazon training partners, but we're really big on not just the expertise portion, which is the lecture and learning how the system is supposed to work and how it's supposed to function, but also getting experience, which is actually doing the implementation of AWS services, and what does that look like? And then we're going to cover some paths, like for architects, for operations folks, some ways in which, depending on whether you are in a design role primarily, a coding role primarily, or an implementation role primarily, some different paths that you can follow, and then just a very small and short suggestion for continual mastery in our world of information saturation, right? So what we're not really going to do today is I'm not really here to talk to you about the value of AWS or to sell buzzwords to. I'm not here to talk about any of that, right? I personally am a fan of all of the, at least the top 3, 4, maybe 5, I would say, cloud providers. But we're here to talk mainly about AWS today. We're not talking about any other provider. I'm also not here to talk about buzzwords, which also have substance to them, like Kubernetes, because I am a DevOps advocate, so Kubernetes is one of my areas of specialty, or containers or any variation thereof, right? My main focus is just to talk about things that are relevant for AWS mastery and training. So just to mention this, how did I get started? Because it might be worth not necessarily to validate my expertise, but just to share my journey, because maybe some of you have some similarities. So in 2011, a friend of mine called who had just inherited a whole infrastructure. This is in November of 2011. And he called me out of the blue and he said, Michael, for whatever reason, my entire staff has just left the organization. I don't know what politics were involved. And he said, can you come help me, because I need someone to come in and assist with AWS. Now, of course, when I started, I knew a lot about VMware. I knew of AWS because in 2011, AWS was 5 years old at that point, because they released their first service in 2006. So, you know, I thought at the time, I was like, oh yeah, that's easy. AWS is just other people's servers in the cloud. I'm used to this with virtualization. You know, I'm familiar with VMware. Let's do it, right? And of course, since that time, since November 2011, I have done nothing but work on either purely AWS infrastructures or hybridized infrastructures, because I couldn't have been more wrong about it being just other people's servers. It's actually a different way of thinking and a different way of approaching a truly software-defined infrastructure where everything's an API. So that's how I got started. and I haven't really left since that time. Now, to that end, let's talk about prerequisites. So in order for you to really start down this path, one, you have to consider yourself technical. If you're going to get into APIs and the command line, and you're going to be starting up virtual servers and messing with containers and doing object storage and figuring out how content delivery networks work, you have to be comfortable with those terms and that jargon. So you need to consider yourself technical really as a prerequisite before you start down this path. If you feel like you don't really have that, then probably getting started in this is going to be too deep. And so just start there. Make sure that you consider yourself technical and that you have some fundamental knowledge of IT, not necessarily cloud per se. Second prerequisite is that you got to be comfortable with the command line. I don't care if it's PowerShell or a POSIX compliant shell like Bash, right? But probably most likely you're going to want to have some kind of Linux command line experience, and then possibly just PowerShell depending on which ecosystem you're working in. There are a lot of PowerShell tools now for the AWS command line in PowerShell, so you don't necessarily need to just have a Linux shell experience of some type. PowerShell will also function. It would be extremely useful if you're comfortable not just with the command line or even a scripting language, right? But it'd be really great if you had some kind of OO experience with either Python or Ruby or even Go or C# or some programming language that has object orientation, because while you can get away with manipulating a bunch of that stuff in a shell scripting language or on the command line, you are going to be syntactically writing JSON and manipulating data and manipulating YAML and variations thereof. So as a prerequisite, you need to at least be able to hack, even if you're not a feature programmer, you need to be able to hack at least one particular language. Number three, you need to have an idea of what you're going to use on AWS. A lot of people start with something simple like, hey, I just want virtual machines, right? Or object storage, which is S3, the simple storage service on AWS. What's funny about that is people start there, and the next thing you know, they find themselves consuming a wide variety of services. But you have to have some idea of what you're going to use AWS for, because that leads to step number 4, which is that you have to have a compelling why. What is your compelling reason to master or study AWS? Is it to further your career? Is it because infrastructure is now really an afterthought? You really want to make sure that you have a compelling technical reason to consume AWS services, and you have a compelling personal/professional reason for wanting to study AWS services. All other things flow from that, right? For some people, it might be money. For some people, it might be expertise and mastery. For some people, it might be very tactical, such as, hey, I want to go work for, Home Depot, and they really love Kubernetes, so I need to learn the Elastic Kubernetes service, so I need to learn the systems engineering stuff, right? The systems operation stuff, right? So those are the prereqs. Just to check, because I will periodically stop, just make sure there are no questions that I'm missing. And just check really quick just to make sure there's anything burning other than the link. There we go. Okay, good. Looks like Alex or somebody pasted the presentation link. Good. All right. So let's talk about step number 1. Oh, but first, I will be throwing pictures in here because if you can't laugh in life, then there's problems, right? But if you ever watched The Mandalorian, this is the child who is they all call Baby Yoda, breaking the internet. So here's step 1. Step 1 is to choose your exam, right? Why do I say choose your exam? Because, Michael, you said this didn't necessarily have to be certification. Because understanding which path you will take for certification, even if you decide not to go for certification, will help tailor the resources for your particular role. And by the way, you'll see the link in the upper right-hand side, and when you download the PDF, it is fully active, so the links work as you click through them. That is, if there's a link available. So if you click on that certification link, you'll actually be taken to a very similar web page that has these pictures on it. And what this does is this allows you to choose not only what your role is with AWS. Are you going to be a developer? Are you going to be a system engineer, like systems operations person? DevOps can even be focused there. Or are you doing more design work, and so you're going to be more of an architect, There are specialty exams. Those are much deeper level exams in terms of complexity and expertise, but they are there. And so typically we recommend that you get at least an associate's level understanding before you move on to the specialty exams, and that you be a specialist, that you actually are a specialist before you do the special exams. So in other words, you need to be working in networking if you're going to do advanced networking as a specialty exam inside AWS. You need to be working as a security specialist if you're actually going to go take the security exam from AWS. So here, if you're choosing your path, what you would do is you would say, okay, well, where am I at? If you've never worked with AWS at all, you're going to start with the foundational course, which is Cloud Practitioner. And so what that would mean is that as we go through the next steps, what you choose here is going to inform which resources you consume. So let's say, for example, that you were a developer, and that's the path you're going to start at the associate's level because you've been working with AWS for a second, so you had some experience, or you've been associated with a team that was working with AWS, and you're already a pretty decent programmer. And so you were like, I just want to learn how a developer is going to use AWS. Like, what services do I have? In that particular case, you might skip the foundational exam as a path, right? And you might go straight to developing on AWS, which is that developer on the far right-hand side in the blue hexagon. And so what you would do is that once you chose your path here as step one, just from a certification perspective, what you would then do, by the way, is you would then go and read up on the relevant exam guide. Now, you saw me just skip over a bunch of stuff, but don't worry, I'll go back. And so I just wanted to make sure that's clear, is that choosing your path in this first screen is super important because it'll let you know all of the resources that you will consume after, right? So just pick your role. I would highly recommend, by the way, that if you decide to go straight for a professional exam, which, by the way, used to not be possible, but AWS now allows you to not take any of the preceding exams, and you can go straight for a professional level exam if you want to. It's highly recommended that you have production experience, years, if possible, with AWS before you go straight for a professional exam. But, you know, if you are feeling bold and you want to go straight for it, great. Just remember those exams are orders of magnitude harder than the associate exams and the foundational exams, and the specialty exams are orders of magnitude harder than even the professional exams. So just be aware of that as you're deciding what kind of expertise you want to build with AWS. Again, let's move on from certifications. By the way, it is worth mentioning that AWS has new certifications coming out all the time. They do refresh them every couple of years. So they're typically, by the way, the certifications are typically 55 to 75 questions if memory serves. Should not be super accurate. And you basically take the questions and there's multiple choice or multiple right answers that you can choose. And they have everything from database specialties to analytics specialties to, of course, things that you saw there with the DevOps engineering, solutions architecture, et cetera. All right, so you've peered through the AWS clouds and you've figured out that you're going to take a role, right? Now, whichever role you've decided on, there's actually two possible next steps. If one of the roles that you're interested in taking is either a developer, operations, or architecture, notice I didn't say security. I didn't say like a database specialist or big data or data analytics or networking, right? If you're going to take one of these three roles, what's interesting is that Amazon has recently released what they call ramp-up guides. And these ramp-up guides are really interesting because the ramp-up guides take a bunch of the resources that Amazon already had, and they basically make them available in a very consumable format. Let me show you what that looks like. Bear with me just one second. So the ramp-up guide is a PDF guide that anyone can download from the Amazon website. And what you'll see here is that it will give you basically a step-by-step, phase-by-phase training that you can follow with active links, such as what is cloud computing, or an overview of AWS, or if you want to take the Cloud Practitioner's Essentials course, there's a free digital training for that, or you can sign up for the classroom course. And so the ramp-up guide is really awesome because if you can do or are doing one of these three particular roles, namely a developer role, an operations role, or an architecture role, like a design role, they've got ramp-up guides that will basically walk you through all of the white papers, all of the trainings, and everything that you want to take a look at. Now, do you need to memorize every single thing that's here? You know, I would argue that you definitely want to study it. You want to get to a very high retention rate, but I don't think you need to be flawless in order to pass the exam. Because typically, just to say this, an 80% isn't passing the exam, but you know, I want to encourage you that that's just an expertise aspect, right? We haven't even gotten to the hands-on piece. But you're going to be spending time building expertise and experience before you take an exam if you choose to do so. And that combination of expertise and experience is what leads to continual mastery. It's not just the certification. The certification is an afterthought on the path that we're talking about. So you'll see in the ramp-up guide here, right, that there is a very clear phase 0. And that basically sets the foundations from the ramp-up guide. And I believe all the ramp-up guides are the same for these three. For phase 0, they all talk about, do you understand what the fundamentals of the cloud are? Do you understand things like the glossary, like all the different acronyms? Do you understand different job roles that could happen inside of AWS? And so using the ramp-up guide, that's step 2A, which is basically, if there is a ramp-up guide, then follow the ramp-up guide. Like, figure out where it's at and basically consume it. Now, what do you do if there isn't a ramp-up guide? What if I'm not interested in architecture, I'm not interested in operations, I'm not interested in development? Well, that's where the 2B comes in. So the 2B comes in, basically says, read the relevant exam guide. So the relevant exam guide, what that means is that on the certifications page for almost every certification, there is, oops, bear with me one second. There are exam guides for every single possible path you could take that Amazon officially supports. So for example, let's say you're like, well, you know what? I actually want to follow a security path. And so I'm kind of more curious to see if, you know, following that path, because there's no ramp-up guide for it. So what you can do is you can download what's called the exam guide. And in the exam guide, which by the way, there's an exam guide for everything, not just for architecture, development, or systems operations. The exam guide will give you specific objectives that you need to take for the exam, and then references to specific training such as security, instructor-led or virtual courses, self-paced courses like security fundamentals, which is listed here. And in addition, a number of other like white papers, including documentation and compliance, etc. Now remember, you don't have to go take the certification on security, but you can still leverage the exam guide for security to make sure that you are building a deep level of expertise and experience on security on AWS. So it can still be very, very useful, even if certification is not your goal. But the exam guides exist for every path inside AWS that they've published. And so you can read the exam guide and start to figure out exactly what you need to do to develop the strength in that area. So that's step 2B. Basically, if there is a ramp-up guide, then read the relevant exam guide and go from there. Now just check, see if there's any questions. No, it's looking good. All right. So step 1, you're going to pick your path. In a sense, pick your poison, right? What role do you want to have? Do you want to build expertise for inside AWS? Step 2A is that if there is a relevant ramp-up guide, of which there's only 3 as of the writing of this particular presentation, then read the ramp-up guide, because the ramp-up guide will give you phased approaches to how you consume and build expertise. If there's no ramp-up guide, or maybe even in addition to the ramp-up guide, you can go read the relevant exam guide. Exam guides exist for all the paths that you saw hexagons for in step 1. Now, let's say you've read the, like this is the developer exam guide, you've gone through, you've looked at it, you've identified all the things that you don't know about the command line, and you've looked up in the glossary acronyms like IAM, Glacier, S3, right, STS. You've done all that relevant work, right? Then in that case, you've already done step 3. Because step 3 is not just what you did in step 2 where you found the relevant guide, right? Step 3 was to actually do what the guide says, right? So you don't just obtain the guide, but you go through, and if it has a white paper in the exam guide, go read it. There's a class, take it, right? And if there's vocabulary you don't know, make sure you look it up. The only thing that I would say that I'm not a huge fan of when it comes to the prep and the exam guide is AWS's exam questions are not as robust as other options. So one of our steps here is that I'm going to recommend to you, and you'll get this in the presentation as well, very specific study guides, basically practice exam questions that are official right off of Udemy, right? That I highly recommend that you would engage with instead of taking AWS's exam prep. The only main reason for that is that the Udemy exam practice questions that we recommend actually tell you the right answer, the wrong answer, and they tell you why, and they refer to the specific documentation. The exam guide is not as comprehensive as I would like it to be. And the other thing to mention about step 3 as far as like practicing and prepping for whatever expertise that you're building is it would be better to spend a little bit of time each day instead of massively investing a couple hours, say once a week, because you want to reinforce it. And a massive amount doesn't actually keep that daily retention or daily practice going so that you can retain the information. You know, we get stronger in stuff that we do a little bit every day or every other day. So, step 4. So steps 1, 2, and 3 are really about how do we gather knowledge? How do we get lecture experience? How do we get information? Don't get me wrong. I teach the official AWS classes. I'm an Amazon authorized training instructor, right? We throw in as much experience as possible, as many hands-on labs as possible, but we're a little unique in that because most of the official content has some labs, but they're very rote, right? It's very do this, do this, do this, and do this, right? Which, again, can be very useful, but when you take classes with us, they're more freeform. But that all being said, there are some really great free hands-on labs that you can go put your hands on that have some of that step-by-step quality, but also have some of that challenge quality where it's like, oh, how would you solve this? How would you solve that? So I have some listed here, but let me show you what those look like on a web page. So I'm going to sign in really quick because apparently it's asking me to do so. And so what you'll see here is I'm actually logged in QuickLabs, which is our recommendation. And in this particular case, it is pre-formatted so that the search is actually set for Amazon Web Services, any format and any level. And if you go through this, by the way, for QuickLabs. QuickLabs is the official lab provider for AWS. Oddly enough, I think it's owned by Google. I think it got bought in 2016. But anybody can sign up for this. And when you see it says free on the cost, that means basically that you can create a free account, come in here and learn about AWS IAM and learn about DynamoDB, all without costing you a dime. Each credit, by the way, if you see something that says it costs a credit, each credit will cost you $1. So if it says 8 credits, it'll cost you $8. There's some really amazing labs out here on QuickLabs, since it is the official provider for AWS Labs. These are public classes, so very useful for anybody to sign up and use for. But like to give you an example, if you click into Introduction to DynamoDB, it'll open up a lab, and you'll actually have the instructions right there on the web page, like creating a table and whatnot. But before that, you'll see a timer and a green Start Lab button on the upper left-hand side. If you click Start, what will happen is it will actually start the lab. You can open the console, and it will actually log you into an official AWS console. Just a reminder, though, is that once that timer hits 0, this whole lab will delete itself and shut down. Just a way in which they kind of manage costs so that people don't abandon the labs in the middle of them. Once you start the timer, you got to finish the lab. So that's part of getting some hands-on experience. That's step number 1. That's the pre-formatted link that we just clicked on. And so again, that's just QuickLabs, which is spelled with a W, not a QUI. And you can get access to a ton of free and or low dollar labs on AWS on almost every topic, at least 6 topics. So everything from Lambda to CloudFront to API Gateway, there's just some really amazing stuff out here. You just check on questions just to make sure there's none lingering or outstanding. We'll repost the PDF link just to make sure it's all working. Yeah, good. All right. So the other thing I want to mention is in terms of building experience, not expertise, because we covered that already, is that steps 2, 3, and 4, or sub-steps under step 4, basically, are the EC2 Spot workshops, the ECSworkshop.com, and the EKSworkshop.com. What are these, right? These are basically unpublished, meaning they're on the official documentation, but Amazon is not necessarily wildly promoting these yet, but they're Amazon published labs that you can do if you have an AWS account. Now you can create a free account, set some billing limits on it so you don't spend more than $10 or $20 a month, depending what your limitations are. But it'll cost you about maybe $10, maybe $20 to do all of the labs listed on these links. Now, why would you do that? What's the interest here? So if you look on the left-hand side, for example, for EC2SpotWorkshops.com, there are things that, like how to use Spot instances with the Elastic Kubernetes service. There's how to do deep learning. There's how to run CI/CD and test loads. There's how to do auto-scaling. These labs are incredibly comprehensive, and they're really, really good. And I cannot recommend enough that if you do all the labs just listed on these 3 URLs, you will gain a wealth of experience about how the AWS functions, and it's quite impressive. So for example, if you look at this, this is a self-paced workshop, and this is the last one about auto-scaling with the particular instance types. It'll do things like present architecture to you. It'll tell you what kind of like auto-scaling groups it's using. It will run through and show you how to set up stuff with CloudFormation, right? So that you can learn how to use Amazon's native kind of infrastructure provisioning tool. It'll also let you play with things like Cloud9. Now, don't get me wrong, this will cost you. But if you do all the labs in one fell swoop, it'll probably cost you about $10, right? All in all. Maybe 20 if you decide to linger and go slow. Totally worth it for what you're granted. So this walks through things like creating a CloudFormation stack, how to monitor stack creation, how to use the native IDE inside AWS. It just covers so much, including things like installing the command line utilities. So this and the other links that have been shared, like the EC workshop, which covers the containers, or the EKS workshop, which covers the Elastic Kubernetes service inside AWS, there's a wealth of information here. And like, for example, under the EKS, which I consider probably the more complex of the 3 URLs, there are a ton of labs such as using Kubeflow or creating a service mesh or using an Argo workflow doing batch processing. Some really advanced and really cool stuff listed here for how you would manipulate Kubernetes as a managed service. Good. So just to check questions, just to make sure I'm not missing anything. Done these times before, are the time projects similar to these? How close to are these? I'm not really sure a real-time project scenario. Oh, like a real, like how close are these project scenarios to real? They're actually, at least for the ones for the links, not necessarily the ones in QuickLabs. The ones here listed out under the EC2 Spot workshops and the ECS workshops and the EKS workshop, those are very realistic. They remarkably match a lot of the deployment scenarios that I've done with AWS over my 9 years of using it. These are, for QuickLabs, are more task-oriented, like how do you create cross-region replication. They are remarkably accurate. They're not necessarily comprehensive. So there might be things missing, like, hey, did you turn on CloudTrail for logging? Or, how are you doing data classification in your S3 bucket? But they're great when you're just getting started. These are obviously the free introductory labs. There are more expert labs down here that you can click on if you're looking for something really advanced. But the scenarios demonstrated here are remarkably accurate. Excellent. Good questions. All right. So step 4 is to get some hands-on experience. I will also, it's worth saying is that make sure that when you sign up for classes, I'm not necessarily saying just Webage, although we're pretty good at it, right? But when you sign up for classes, if you decide to take a class, make sure they are providing not just expertise, that they are giving you hands-on experience. Like, just as an example, if you take a lab with us, you walk away with a number of credits with QuickLabs so that you can get advanced exposure to advanced topics around AWS. So we make sure that you have plenty of opportunities even after you leave class to continue to refine your experience and your expertise. If you decide that you want to use one of the training platforms like Safari Books Online or Linux Academy or Cloud Academy or any of those, Udemy, any of those, make sure that you're paying for a service that provides you with labs. You need the hands-on experience. That's how it gets reinforced. It's not enough to just read about how, for example, S3 functions. You have to have you have to create an S3 bucket. You have to, set up versioning in an S3 bucket. You have to turn on CloudTrail. You have to, know how to optimize for hotspots. Those are things that you will run into in the real world. How do you troubleshoot an S3 bucket when all of a sudden it becomes overloaded? Under what conditions will an S3 bucket become overloaded? So just make sure that if you decide to take a class or you decide that you're going to use one of the video platforms, that you have lab access. For example, and one of my favorites is Linux Academy because they offer hands-on labs for their subscription, right? Udemy doesn't necessarily offer labs with their classes, right? Safari Books Online just bought Kata, which is a great kind of playground to play with to get hands-on experience. So if they don't offer labs, don't use them. It's not going to be worth it. You need something that for the same cost is going to give you expertise and experience. So that's step 4. I did already show you, actually, right? So let's talk about step 5. Step 5 is, okay, so you've chosen your role inside of AWS, right? So therefore, that's kind of helped you figure out the guides that you're going to use. You've gotten some hands-on experience. And even whether or not you're taking the exam or not, how do you know that you are knowledgeable about what you need to know, both from an expertise standpoint and potentially from an experience standpoint, but mainly from an expertise standpoint? Because who can cover all the different experiential scenarios we'll have, right? In this case, that you actually take a look at practice exams. What do we recommend? Well, we have some recommendations, and you'll get those when you get the guide, but here's an example. So this is actually on Udemy, which is interesting because I just said don't buy it if you don't have labs on Udemy, but this is great for practice tests, right? And this is one of the specific guides that we're recommending. So like in this particular case, this is showing all of the developer associate practice exams that I've taken, which is the 3. And this is practice exam 1. And what's interesting about this is that this is showing not only what I got wrong, but why I got wrong, why I got it wrong. Like, it's basically saying, look, in this particular case, which is a question about X-ray, which is used for tracing, right? The first answer was correct. The second one that I chose was actually incorrect. And it will tell me exactly why that answer is right, why the other answers are wrong, and it will give me references so that I can dive deeper into understanding not only the topic at hand, but what it is that I potentially didn't know or learn about the topic. And so the exam guides that we've referenced inside of our particular setup all operate the same way, right? They'll not only tell you why the answer is right, they'll not only tell you why the other answers are wrong, they will give you reference links and guides to official AWS documentation, including some cheat sheets if you want to kind of flashcard / memorize your information a little bit deeper. So we highly recommend that the only exam guides that you take are ones that follow this kind of format. Excellent. I'm really interested in ending the meeting. We'll keep going. All right, so we've got practice exams for developer associates, for SysOps associates, for the 2 pro exams, and for the cloud practitioner exams. We don't necessarily have any for the specialty exams just yet, but in future iterations of this webinar, we'll be adding them on. Typically, especially at the specialty level around security and networking, pieces like that, it's a much deeper dive, but eventually there'll be some really good specialty exam certification practice exams that will come out, and we will recommend them at that time. Good. So step 5 is to practice. Now, when you decide, again, whether you're going for certification or not, that you're going to challenge yourself and make sure that you understand how these systems work or are supposed to work, just make sure that you get a 95% on the practice exams. Now, why do I recommend 95%? Because if you do decide eventually to go for certification, obviously the questions are not an exact match, plus you're going to be nervous, there's going to be a little bit of stress involved. And so, you know, if you do that, you're almost like, I wouldn't say it's a guarantee, but it's pretty close to a guarantee that you're going to pass, right? Because you're going to lose 10 points probably for stress and deviations and stuff like that. So if you do take the practice exams, just keep taking them until you've really mastered the knowledge and the information, study the areas that you feel gappy in, and then you'll be ready. If you decide to go forward to certification, you can. But at that point, you also know that, hey, I've got this topic down even if you don't go for certification. Now, that being said, you might, at the very end, decide, you know what, I'm going to schedule my exam because I've done all this study. I've read all the white papers on the, you know, the 5 well-architected pillars, so the well-architected framework, right? I've studied all the design areas. I've taken the class. I've studied it, you know, in person with an instructor, or maybe I did it, you know, classroom digital training. And you might want to just validate and get the certification at that point because you've built your expertise and your knowledge. So step 6 is optional, but you might want to go ahead and schedule your exam at that point in time, just to show people what you know. Now, you can say what you want because this discussion has been going on for a long time. People kind of poo-poo exams. You know, is it paper? Is it real? Hopefully, if you're following our expertise plus experience path, you'll know that these are not paper certifications. By the time you've earned the certification, you can look someone right in the eye and say, yeah, no, I not only passed the exam, I know how to do what I'm talking about, right? That's what we're looking for. One kind of mention, right, is that in the previous step 2A, when we were talking about the ramp-up guides, that was the developer guide. Just know that if you're in an architect role, you want to follow the ramp-up guide from that step as well, right, which has details like how to learn, you know, fundamentals of cloud architecture, and it goes really deep, right? So, like with the architecture role, it goes all the way up to phase 3. If you decide, by the way, that you're going to do an operations role, it still follows the same phases, right? Like a DevOps operations role, but there's an even slightly deeper phase where there's more content and more information, and you'll even like dive into things like, you know, how to prepare for Docker and how to prepare for Kubernetes. And so there's actually like a phase 4 on the SysOps content. Now the ramp-up guides, just to mention this, for developer, for architecture, and for systems operations or DevOps, right? Those guides will take you all the way from beginner all the way to the professional level exams. So I just want to make sure I emphasize that, and that these ramp-up guides are not just focused on one particular level, they're focused on all 3 levels from beginner all the way to the professional level setup inside of AWS. Okay. One thing that happens a lot, like this is actually an image from a GitHub repo of a gentleman who said, these are all the things you need to consider learning if you want to do DevOps. And there's a lot on here. If you want to become a DevOps engineer, there's a lot on here, but really every single journey just begins with a single step. And so no, really, I recommend that if you're unsure about where to start, you've never touched AWS, you've never worked with a team that's done AWS before, then come here and just start with the Cloud Practitioner Essentials. Just start with Cloud Fundamentals. Don't get wrapped up in, you know, learning like this kind of thing where you're like, okay, I'm gonna have to learn like Python, and I gotta learn the shell, and then I gotta do IO management, understand the Linux kernel and how it's gonna function. And no, yes, that stuff will come over time, right? But if you're just getting started with AWS and you're like, I just really want to know how to begin, to just start with Cloud Essentials. to start with Cloud Practitioner. And the great thing is that that will also let you know whether or not you've met the prerequisites, right? Do you consider yourself technical? Are you comfortable manipulating APIs? Are you comfortable on the command line, right? Do you have a compelling reason, right? You've wasted no investment other than maybe your time, which is very precious, I will acknowledge, if you just start here and see how you do. Another gratuitous Mandalorian picture from the child. There is one last thing here. So let's say that you've figured out your prerequisites. You've chosen a guide to help you navigate the landscape of AWS. You've done what the either ramp-up guide or the exam guide says to do. So you've studied the white papers, you've taken the classes, you've done all the stuff, right? You've gotten hands-on experience, right? So you're totally comfortable there. You've challenged yourself with the exam guides, which, by the way, just to mention the exam guides, always wait until Udemy has a sale if you buy the exam guides. Typically, they're somewhere between, $4 and $12, which is a really great price. Sometimes I've seen them as high as $40. But let's say that you've gotten the exam guides and you challenge yourself. That's step 5. And then, you didn't necessarily need certification, although you could have decided to do it and you got your certificate. But let's say you did all that. What happens then? Is the journey over? Is that it? Right? Well, what ends up happening is that a lot of people I meet, they get involved in their career and they get a lot of passion when they start and they feel some drive. And then after about like 5 to 10 years, they just kind of stop, right? They just kind of go into journeyman mode where they're doing the same things over and over again. And they, interestingly enough, people become resistant to new technologies. They think it's just a fad or a hype. And I agree that there is a lot of hype when something new comes out. People are just, this is the greatest new thing. It's going to change everything. It's going to solve our business problems and help us deliver software better, faster, easier than we've ever seen before. And I admit that there is a lot of hype around some of this stuff, right? There's also substance, because everyone starts with a hype cycle and then gets into real value, like it gets into a mature space, right? But that's no reason for us to stop learning. So I highly recommend that once you even feel like you've achieved some expertise and you're learning new things on the job and you're doing implementations with AWS, make sure that you get involved with some kind of avenue that will, at least on a weekly basis, if not a daily basis, give you like information about what's going on in the AWS ecosystem. Like, I'll give you an example. I'm a fan of RSS feed still, which I do on probably one of my few social media outlets. But like, this is Feedly, which is owned by Google, and I actually have a bunch of topics like compute and data stores and stuff like that underneath my Feedly like topics. And like, this is the compute section. I'm sorry, this is the tool section, not the compute section. It says tools at the top. And then underneath here, you'll see, like, for example, AWS CLI version 2 just became generally available. Now, the rest of this, as far as like unit tests for IAM, which is the first option, or the release notes for CloudFormation, I'm not necessarily going to read that, but I do want to know that they've come out with a new AWS CLI. I might even want to kick the tires on it and see what's different. Like, for example, the AWS version 2 CLI no longer requires like these Python libraries called Boto 3. It's no longer required. It's like kind of bundled in now. And that was always the challenge before, right? But you want to make sure that once you've achieved your desired target for mastery, that it's a continual mastery thing. Like, what is your daily habit, ritual, or practice that gives you just a small piece of new information that you need about your particular tech area of expertise? So in this case, if it's AWS, how are you continually feeding yourself to make sure that your mastery is continuing? Now, none of us have time for a massive investment in retooling and reskilling, but if you spent 15 minutes a day just keeping up on something, maybe trying a blog, downloading a new tool, kicking the tires on something, then you're in that continual mastery area where you're continuing to develop your skills and you continue to stay relevant in the industry. So just want to put a small plug in for that, because I do meet quite a few people who start to stagnate or are resistant to new technologies over time. Good. Daily habit of keeping up. All right. So here we are, kind of bringing it all together, right? So our objective was to show you some very clear steps about how to learn about and follow a path to mastery inside of AWS. So to that end, we talked about prerequisites like considering yourself technical, knowing command line or a programming language, having a compelling use case for why you'd want to use AWS, and then having a compelling reason why, right? So not just a what, but a why. And our trajectory was, to say, okay, which path you're going to choose, what guides are you going to use to navigate that path, do what the guides say, step 3. Step 4 was to get some hands-on experience. Step 5 was to get some challenge, some reinforcement to your expertise by taking some exam questions. Step 6, if you so chose or choose, was to schedule your exam if that was important to you. And then we just briefly skimmed over the ramp-up guide for how you would do design, like an architect's path inside AWS, how you would do a developer's area, even SysOps, DevOps engineering. And then we talked about just continual learning, about just reinforcing your expertise and continuing to develop in this landscape. So what's next? Well, Webage Solutions is one of 5 authorized training partners. And we do a lot of training with a twist. So just know that we're here, willing to help, willing to answer questions, but also just wanting you to know that if you take a class with us, you get so much more than just the official AWS content. You get all of the add-ons and expertise and experience learning that we add to the exam. And then if you want to talk to me or email me, it's michael.forrester, 3 R's, 2 in the beginning for the last name, michael.forrester@webagesolutions.com, right? You can catch me on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter at PeopleForrester. But if you have any questions or anything that you just want to bounce my way, just know that it's one of my core missions in life is to help, elevate humanity at every opportunity. So it's a pleasure for me to help guide people in whatever way that's appropriate for their vision for their lives. So I'm going to stop talking and check chat just to see if there's anything. I will repost the link for the share just in case people need it. So thank you for listening. Again, I'm Michael Forrester, and I appreciate you attending. And please let me know if you have any questions. We're just going to open up for Q&A here in a second. Let's see. So one of the questions is AWS Certified Solutions Architect, but I'm wondering what other skills I can add to my profile to get into a working environment. Maybe Unix, Python scripting? Absolutely. So I would say that being a DevOps advocate, having some kind of like bash shell scripting and or Python scripting, both of those are extremely valuable. And if you want to add in there things like CloudFormation, which I have a love-hate relationship with, but it is the native integrated tool for infrastructure provisioning in AWS, that would be a great addition as well. You can now write CloudFormation in YAML, as of like last year or the year before, whereas before it had to all be in JSON. And Python has some great tools for writing CloudFormation templates as well. The other thing is that's kind of more on the front end of things. So you want fundamentals of scripting in Python, I would say 100% about learning AWS. But you also want to understand systemic ideas inside of DevOps, such as continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment. So CI/CD, for example. Shell scripting in Python will allow you to do automation at a tactical level. But when you put it into a system like Jenkins or GitLab or GitHub Actions, which is pending, that allows you to start manipulating code towards deployment on the back end. And that allows you to create these funnels where you take a code repo and you deliver them out to EC2 instances, or you deliver into the ECS container service or the EKS Kubernetes service. So in addition to going after like bash shell scripting in Python and CloudFormation, right, to allow for that native integration into AWS, I would consider focusing maybe perhaps on a tool like Jenkins or Bamboo or GitLab or GitHub Actions, but probably more likely Jenkins, because I think GitHub Actions is relatively new and in beta. But to know how that orchestration works, because that's really what those tools are, is they are basically code to deployment orchestrators that will leverage whatever you do in shell scripting, Python, and other plugins. So those would be really useful skills to add on to the system. I also will tell you that, I see someone just posted it actually, is that anything to do with Docker first and then Kubernetes, because you really need to know Docker before you get to Kubernetes, because Docker sits on top of Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes hosts the runtime. In this case, it's Docker. And so if you want to run, scale, deploy, and smooth the way of deploying Docker containers in production, Kubernetes is your friend, right? That's why I post the EKS service links here for your review, because in my kind of shallow prediction, in the next 5 to 10 years, the majority of the deployments we're going to be doing are going to be containers on top of Kubernetes. So what I'm seeing is this rush to get to multi-cloud, to get to kind of a more abstracted cloud deployment methodology, but even in the data center, by using Kubernetes as the abstraction layer. So if there was one last tool set or skill set to add on, learn Docker and then learn Kubernetes, because that will serve you well for the next 5 to 10 years of deployment methodologies. Good. Let's see. Any other questions here? Let's see. Let's just test this out just to make sure that I'm not typing something wrong here. Mastering AWS PDF. Oh, it is not working. Well, that explains why the link didn't work. Let's try it again. Let's try AWS. That one functions. There we go. So that one functions. But it looks like also Alex posted a link earlier. See, make sure that's functioning as well. All right. Looks like everything has crawled to a halt all of a sudden. I don't know why that is. Okay. So earlier on, Alex, let's see, posted the presentation. I'm sure that's working. Yeah, looks like it's good from Jira Hero PDF. Yeah, so it looks like this is working. All of the links for everything that I talked about, including the practice exam guides, are all listed inside of this PDF presentation. So if I scroll down to the section that talks about step 5, which is the practice exams, sorry, I know that's scrolling by really fast for people. If we scroll up to step 5 and you click on these links that are listed here, these should open straight into Udemy, right? And take you straight to the practice exams in question. So you should have access to everything at this point. Good. All right. Just see if there's any other questions. We've posted the link here before. Let's see. I just posted it again in case people joined late. Here we go. There we go. All right. Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, going once, going twice, going a third time. Thank you for coming. I'm Michael Forrester. If you have any questions at all, please catch me at michael.forrester@webagesolutions.com. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to catch some of you soon passing your exams, or at least asking questions for how you develop experience and expertise. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great, great weekend.